Coming to you from the West Coast, this is Politicos. Today is September 28th, 2017, and this is episode 54. Politicos is the podcast that explores what's happening in British Columbia and across the country. If you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, where we're at PoliticosPod, and support the show at patreon.com/politicos.
I'm Scott.
And I'm Ian. On today's show, we're going to talk about how the start of the race to replace Christy Clark is shaping up, and we'll do a series of quick roundups. It'll be a bit of a shorter show, but that's all right. First, we have to thank our premier sponsor, Lindsay Teds, for helping make this happen, as well as all of our other patrons who helped buy us a bunch of fancy new recording equipment, so that half the show is at least sounding better today, as I sit here with the fancy gear. And Scott, you're in Kingston, right?
Yes, and I'm recorded on our cheap lapel mics at the moment, so the patrons don't get to enjoy the full setup yet.
It was a good $3 for that mic, and it's done its job well. But hopefully in the next couple of weeks, once I figured out how this giant mixer board that's way overpowered for what we're doing works, and learn how to audio engineer. So how was Ottawa? Did you manage to have any fun while you were there?
Yeah, I enjoyed it, saw the sights, caught up with a few old friends, and yeah, it was a good couple days there.
Great. Well, let's get into our main segment. I guess I'll call it, it's not a right-wing leadership race if you can count the candidates on one hand. The BC Liberal leadership race is starting to kick off. As we mentioned at the end of our last show, it looked like Diane Watts was about to announce. And as we were sort of recording / editing the next day, turns out everyone else decided to announce at the same time. So now we actually have a race.
Yeah, so Sam Sullivan, the former Vancouver mayor, had actually announced last Thursday, and we both kind of missed it just before our recording. So we were wrong when we said that Diane Watts was the first one in. Sullivan beat her to it by a little bit. But yeah, basically over the last couple of days, most of the people who are expected to run have announced.
The one who's potentially still on there is Todd Stone, who is undeclared, but apparently he has a campaign team coming together and will probably launch next month. But as of right now, we have, I think, 8 different names already in the race, or 8 if you count Todd Stone. So as you mentioned, Sam Sullivan, local Vancouver MLA. We have Diane Watts, who we've mentioned already, former mayor of Surrey and Conservative MP. There's Michael Lee, another MLA, Mike DeJong, longtime MLA, Bernier, former education minister, Andrew Wilkinson, and a relative unknown, Lucy Sager. Any of those people stand out to you? You're more maybe open to voting for this or joining and voting for this?
Yeah, I'm not super involved in those circles, so I don't know a huge amount on the details and what's happening behind the scenes and whatnot, and who has the best campaign team. But just looking at what's come out so far, Sullivan's the one that's most interesting, I think, in that his announcement leaned pretty heavily on policy stuff, where the rest, all the coverage around them has been a lot more general, hey, we need a new leader, time to renew the party, all of that stuff, where Sullivan took some fairly controversial positions right out of the gate.
It reminds me of how at the federal level, Maxime Bernier launched with a very policy-heavy kind of approach and leaned into that for the first couple months, really talking up some big ideas for the Conservative Party of Canada leadership. And that's one way to get that early attention, especially when you have a number of sitting and former MLAs and cabinet ministers to really stand out saying, hey, here's some big ideas to change it. Like the maybe most controversial is this modified sales tax, which is essentially the HST. Well, controversial for BC. Controversial for BC.
Well, I thought the privatized medicine would have been the thing that would be the most controversial in there.
Well, in terms of what I personally don't want to see is, he's big into furthering the privatization of medicine, more charter schools, selling government liquor stores. At least BC liquor stores aren't as bad as LCBOs, which you're getting to deal with right now. But the history of the HST in BC for any of the leadership candidates to lead with that. I get building up to it maybe, but it's a bold opening move.
Yeah, so for those of our listeners who missed the announcement, he's proposing a quote unquote modified sales tax, which is it's HST rebranded with a couple extra carve outs for low income people to address that concern.
And then he's also talking a lot more about urban issues and the need for densification, some drug addiction issues that are more health based than crime based, some, what's this, chronic addiction substitution treatment? I'm not familiar with that.
I gather it has something to do with substituting out the more harmful drugs for a less harmful one as a process to wean people off, I think. I haven't really looked into it too much.
So he's got a mix of liberal harm reduction approaches and more libertarian or economic right. I guess maybe he's going for that socially liberal, fiscal conservative magic voter.
Yeah, possibly.
Then the rest of them don't have a lot out there other than maybe talking about how they need to listen to voters. That's something Mike Bernier said. Diane Watts, interestingly, I saw Rebel Media pumping up her entry into the race. One of the pundits, I guess they have, Van City Chris on Twitter, was tweeting it out with her entering the race really heats it up. And it was a pretty positive piece for the Rebel Media, which she never struck me as the white nationalist end of the Conservative Party. Maybe she leaned into a little bit of the tough on crime stuff.
Well, if you read the piece, the whole thing was basically half the party is federal liberal, so if we can get anyone who's a conservative in there, it's a win. I think they called her a red Tory in there, which, as far as the rebels concerned, might as well be Justin Trudeau.
Well, speaking of red Tories, I was looking up some of the stuff about Michael Lee, who's a first-time MLA. I think he was only elected in this last election just in May, but he's already put his name forward to run. His past is mostly as a corporate lawyer, but it turns out he was actually an aide to Kim Campbell back when she was a minister in Brian Mulroney's cabinet. And I saw it pitching him as a more like conservative connected, but the Mulroney Kim Campbell connection is just feels more red Tory, if anything.
Yeah, he definitely is a federal conservative, but I gather he's on the more red Tory end of the spectrum.
And do we also need to talk about how we have 3 Mikes in this race already? Out of a race of 8 people, there are 3 Mikes or Michaels. At least there's some women, some people of color, and so there's some diversity in there, but it could get confusing if they start going by first names.
Yeah, I think we'll be sticking with last names on this one.
Well, on Mike Bernier, he was, as I mentioned, the one who talked about the need to listen to voters. He's going to have a tough uphill battle with talking about his past as education minister, but in terms of his initial pitch, he actually played up his involvement in making sexual orientation and gender identity protected in school policies. And he talks about how his daughter is gay. And so I think he's also trying to go for that socially liberal, maybe economically conservative. We'll see what the rest of his pitch is. I can't imagine he's going to run on the left on everything. But it's interesting to start to see some of the candidates position themselves. I'm not clear if we're going to have a real social conservative running. I guess maybe that could be Diane Watts, but even there, like we said, sort of red Tory.
Yeah, I don't think we're going to see much of that. The BC Liberal Party is fairly well split between the federal and between the federal Liberals and Tories, and there just isn't a huge amount of traction on the social issues, as far as I can tell. It's kind of one of those things where it just gets drowned out in favor of the things they actually agree on, namely keeping the NDP out of power.
Yeah, that's definitely the modus operandi, the raison d'etre. That's the Latin French phrase to use here.
French.
The other thing I'm sort of looking at is you have a mix in here of people who are new to the party, people who've been long-term stalwarts, and I really have to wonder how well someone like Mike DeJong is going to do when it might be that time for renewal. And if you go for someone who's been around for longer than some of your youngest party members, are you really showing signs of renewal there?
Yeah, it's going to be a tricky one for them to figure out. The loss was slight enough. I could see just kind of the pitch being, if we only just change one or two things, get rid of Christy Clark and have someone else, it's not going to be, we can pick up those couple seats and reclaim power. So I'm not sure how much there's the huge impetus to kind of renew the party in a big way rather than kind of a surface level renewal. Also running is Andrew Wilkinson. We've talked about him a few times. Former Advanced Education Minister, briefly Attorney General during the weird period after the election. Super accomplished, lawyer, doctor, Rhodes Scholar, but also kind of has that slightly aloof elitist thing going for him. So it's going to be interesting to see how he does connecting with people outside of kind of his core constituency.
And then there's Lucy Sager, I think it's maybe pronounced. She's a business owner from Terrace in northern BC. She's worked in development in oil and gas and on a few campaigns as a campaign manager, mostly for Ellis Ross in Skeena and as a riding president. So kind of party insider.
Yeah, she's notable in this one that she's the only unelected person running. We have Diane Watts, who's not elected provincially, but has held both federal and municipal positions. But yeah, Lucy Sager is kind of making the big jump from never run before to full-on leader, and well, that's going to be an uphill battle.
Yeah, I think it's one of those get your name out there, get a bit of exposure, not quite in the Kevin O'Leary way. He already had pretty high name recognition, but maybe in the Rick Peterson or some of the also rans in the federal conservative race. So I wouldn't be surprised if she didn't stick it out through the end, and if she then ran as a candidate in the next election. Although it'll be a bit harder since the Liberals have a pretty good hold on rural BC.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if we see, once the first set of fundraising numbers come out, for someone like her to just drop out due to poor fundraising.
Well, and then there's Todd Stone, as I mentioned, former transportation minister, MLA in Kamloops, and I believe relatively popular there. Again, he's still trying to put together his team, but it seems like he's willing to take a bit stronger stances on the political party subsidies. He said if he were leader, he would just give it back to the taxpayers because the BC Liberals shouldn't accept that, even if the NDP and Greens pass it into law.
Well, it's a bold position to take.
Especially when you're sort of kneecapped on other fundraising options.
Yeah, as they have to reinvent their fundraising model.
So, 8 people in the race. First public leadership debate is going to be on October 15th. I'm sure we'll come back to it with a longer, deeper dive, probably in the early new year before the race closes.
Okay, yeah, so the vote's going to be held first week of February, and the deadline for membership is the 29th of December, but that is also the deadline to register as a leadership candidate. So in theory, we could see another few people throw their hat into the ring sometime later.
Well, the only other question I have for you about the race is, what's the actual hashtag for this on Twitter? Because I've seen people use BCLPLDR, BCLibLDR, and BCLib18.
It's a good question. I haven't actually seen it kind of congeal behind one. All kind of the early adopters, so to speak, are throwing out their preferences, but as far as I can tell, there hasn't been a official or even unofficial hashtag for this yet.
So the race for the hashtag is still on before we get the race for the leader.
Yes. Okay, moving on. Twit takes. Barts flew in Victoria this week over the issue of partisan appointments. As basically every party that has ever formed government in the history of Canada has done, the new government in Victoria has given a bunch of positions to longtime NDP members, former, staff, people who have close ties to the party, and Andrew Weaver's not too happy about it, calling it sickening and offensive, actually.
Oh, and also hypocritical and crap and egregious broken promise, and he had no shortage of outrage to muster over this.
Yeah, so this is, as I mentioned, something that's pretty typical throughout Canadian political history and it's basically par for the course. But the only thing is, the NDP took a pretty hard line against the Liberals' partisan appointments back when they were in opposition, so it's given the Green Party a big opening to come at them hard over, well, hypocrisy mostly.
The biggest mistake here for the NDP was probably Cassandra Dyke, I believe it's pronounced, or Dickey, who was the 2013 candidate in Courtney Comox. And it's one thing when you have sort of a campaign, it's one thing when you have a campaign manager who knows a person, you put them into a similar managerial role and still helping out, or comms people come with you because you know them, you trust them, and they know your style. But to put a failed candidate in really looks dicey and crony. Of course, I don't know the statistics of if the NDP has done significantly worse versus the BC Liberals and previous governments in BC or at other levels. That would be an interesting analysis to actually look at rather than just, well, everyone does this. It's, well, did they put their hacks in positions of power, or were they just the comms people who would generally be somewhat partisan anyway? And of course, from the Greens' point of view, any single time when Andrew Weaver can criticize the NDP and distinguish himself, he's going to take that as an opportunity to distinguish his party so that they aren't just criticized as subservient to John Horgan.
Yeah, so it's a smart move politically on Weaver's part. And yeah, it's one of those things that it was just a dumb promise on the NDP's part in the first place. They probably shouldn't have made it if they ever expected to take power, but it's one of those things that, like I said, basically everyone does. But it does kind of look bad because they weren't elected on a promise of being just as bad or more or less as bad as the Liberals. They were, in theory, elected on a promise of we're going to be better.
Well, and governing is always different than opposing. In the next story, more locally here in the race for the by-election, independent candidate Jean Swanson this past Saturday held a fairly novel rally for her mansion tax proposal by leading a march on Chip Wilson, the founder of Lululemon's house in Point Grey. His mansion is worth apparently $75 million, and she's calling for an extra 1% tax on properties over $5 million and 2% on properties over $10 million, which would charge Chip an extra $95,000 a year to the city and $98,000 a year to the province.
I mean, there's a pretty good argument to be made that Vancouver property taxes are really too low, and I'll just refer everyone back to our discussion with Professor Tom Davidoff, where we discussed that one in more detail. But the thing I wanted to talk about and why I threw this in here was, I don't know, there's just something I'm a little uneasy with about the idea of singling out an individual who, as far as we know, is following the TATS rules as they exist. And it just, I don't know, had a little bit too much of the
It's a class warfare thing. It is literally trying to get a group of the coalition she's trying to build are renters, people on low incomes, and she's trying to get that group together to find the 0.1% to say they need to pay more. And rather than walking on City Hall once again, as almost every protest does, or outside the art gallery, which actually has a nice new square to protest in, she chose something a bit more novel. And I think that's why this specific march got better press than a lot of other ones, and why it's worth actually talking about is it's something unique. And I don't think she or her supporters are literally wanting to go into Chip's pocket and steal the money, but he's a symbol in this point.
Yeah, it still feels a little sketchy to me, I guess. It'd be one thing if it was just outside of, the mansions in Point Grey, but like singling out a specific individual doesn't really sit well with me, although I get the fact that it's being rather successful, and admittedly we probably wouldn't have been talking about this without it. But as far as the property mansion tats thing goes, like I said, we could probably use a little more property taxes in the city, but the reason Vancouver real estate isn't unaffordable is it's not because of the tax rate on the properties over $5 million. There's a much broader issue at work here.
And what I forgot to mention while we're on the subject of the by-election is there's a forum being organized at St. Andrew Wesley's Church here in Vancouver on October 5th at 7 p.m. And that's put on in part by friend of the show, Micah. And we're hoping to be there and recording it to do a special episode or something. We haven't figured it out yet. But if you can be there on October 5th, you can see the major party candidates and what they stand for.
We have a little follow-up to one of the stories we talked about on episode 30, Ontario's new rent control policy. There was a lot of concern at the time that this was going to lead to a reduction in the number of rental units available, kind of as kind of the standard understanding of what rent control does would indicate. And we got kind of our first signs of what the actual effects of the policy are, as reports come out indicating that more than 1,000 planned purpose-built rental units have been halted and are getting converted to condos projects instead.
So this is a report from the Federation of Rental Housing Providers of Ontario, essentially the rental building lobby group organization. It wasn't, as far as I can tell, buildings that were in the process of being built for rentals, but existing rental units that are now going to condos. So the Ontario government is sticking to its guns and saying, we're pretty confident that our rent control program, our capped rents is working, and they are also going to work on supply. The one thing I found it interesting, though, that's not too surprising, but what I did find interesting about their reply is they point out that there haven't actually been a lot of privately built rental homes in Toronto or in Ontario. I think Toronto, especially with the housing bubble we're in, there's just more money to be made on condos. So the government's somewhat working there on building rental units of its own, subsidized rental units of its own. But it's kind of one of those situations where I almost wonder how many of these rental units would have been converted otherwise. And the coverage almost reads a bit like a Fraser Institute report where it's just kind of glowing and uncritical. Not to say it's necessarily wrong, just there weren't any outside experts really challenging it or
Yeah, and
supporting
those
it.
are fair criticisms for sure. Um, it does kind of conform to what everyone's expectation is, so I think that's partly why it hasn't gotten a lot of high. I think that's partly why it hasn't gotten a high degree of scrutiny in that respect. But you make a good point about how the number of purpose-built rental units has been not that great, kind of basically across the country. We had the same problem in Vancouver. We mentioned last week how basically one of two rental unit. We mentioned last week how only the second rental building in Surrey's opened up in the last 30 years, and it's a much broader problem. But at the same time, in that very constrained environment in terms of new rental properties, 1,000 going off the market's not promising as a where things are going.
Well, Chelsea Manning got some attention in Canada this past week. On Monday, she tweeted out, "So, I guess Canada has permanently banned me, question mark. High five emoji, cowboy hat wearing smiley face emoji, sunset over mountains emoji, Canada flag emotion, Canada flag emoji, at CITLMM Canada, which is the immigration Twitter handle, denied entry because of convictions similar to, quote, treason offenses, thinking emoji, rainbow emoji, hearts emoji." Chelsea Manning's Twitter is amazing, by the way. So the basic story here is Canada has a general policy, like most countries, for people wanting to come and visit, that we don't let convicted criminals in. And so when she applied for a visa, the immigration officials went, "No, you can't come in." The problem here is Manning's kind of a public hero at this point, where we do make exceptions for these kind of cases. Like Conrad Black can get into Canada no problem, even though he gave up his citizenship and then was put in jail for a while, not for giving up his citizenship, for fraud and a bunch of other things. But now Ralph Goodale is saying he'd have to think hard before overruling border officers' decisions. And I don't think anyone's saying he shouldn't think about it, but if there's a clear case of like this person is not a threat to Canada, and if she wants to come here for whatever reason, as long as it's not to, I guess, release Canadian secrets, I think that would be fine.
I think part of the reason he's a little reticent is that, as far as I know, the procedure for challenging these sort of things generally just doesn't go directly to the minister. And at this point, I'll just throw a reference to our friends, the boys in short pants, who did an episode looking at the procedure here. I wish I knew it was which one it was. They need to add a little more detail in their episode description, so when I go back to try and find these things, they're actually easy to find. But they did a really good take it on this with some previous well-known person who also got denied at the border, and it's entirely reasonable that a border officer says no, and there's a procedure to challenge it, and it's the sort of thing that we should let the procedure do its thing. And I'd be surprised if Chelsea Manning or a lawyer didn't already know this might be an issue, and there's a part of me that's wondering if this is a publicity play to make that next appeal easier.
Yeah, her follow-up tweets do say that she will be challenging denial of entry at a, quote, admissibility hearing in the future, but she's saying the laws cited by the immigration officials is not similar to the ones on the website itself, but or are the ones in the criminal code itself. Yeah, I think she's managed to get some good press out of this. In the end, I'm sure it will take time, but she'll probably get her approval. She says she's hoping to travel to Montreal and Vancouver. Let's hope she does get to come to Vancouver, and maybe we can get her on the pod.
And finally, Bombardier is back in the news as the U.S. Department of Commerce has announced an intention to apply a whopping 220% tariff to Bombardier aircraft. This is part of the ongoing spat between Bombardier, Boeing, and now Canada and the U.S. governments as well. Most of the centers around the 75 C series jets that were sold to Delta at a very, very cheap 19 million, I believe. And Boeing's pushed back on it. We talked a bit last week about how everybody subsidized the aerospace industry, so I won't relitigate that. But what I think is most interesting here is that Boeing actually only asked for an 80% tariff, which granted is still pretty steep, but the fact that the U.S. government came back and said, no, 80% is not good enough. We need to go 220.
That's because Trump is such a great businessman. He gets given a number and just like doubles it or 2.5 times is it. It's really just seems like a pissing match. I can't really figure anything else out with this. I don't have much to say other than I feel like everyone's losing in this situation.
These sort of trade disputes are really kind of a case of stop hurting your own citizens, or I'll hurt my own citizens by making everything they buy more expensive. So, yeah, the logic of these trade disputes never makes a huge amount of sense to me. We've also gotten a little fun interprovincial conflict happening over this, as Boeing actually has a branch plant in Winnipeg, I believe. So now you get this fun bit of interprovincial conflict where your Quebec-based aerospace business and a Winnipeg-based aerospace business are fighting it out over who gets the government's favor on this one, which
is going to be Quebec.
Yes, but yeah, this is also reminiscent of the CF-18 contract that got awarded to a Quebec-based company over a Winnipeg-based one and was part of the whole Western alienation, the West wants in, we're not getting a fair deal thing that kind of got going in the 80s.
And just one quick reminder, as I threw in the middle there, that on October 5th at 7 p.m. there'll be that Vancouver by-election forum at St. Andrew Wesley's Church.
And that has been Politos. Find links to the stories we mentioned in the show notes at politos.ca. Make sure to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at PolitosPod. Leave us a review and let us know what you think. Support the show and get early access to our interviews at patreon.com/Polititoast. And if you have ideas for the show, feel free to send them to us. Thanks for listening.